And it looks like they should be starting very shortly here. And as soon as they do, we will switch over. And they are off. We are starting here. DruPeirce with the white pieces versus Gensink with the black pieces. And DruPeirce starting with E4, Gensink E5, and we're getting kind of a common opening here. Both players fighting for attack at the center of the board. DruPeirce following with D3, giving protection to this pawn, as well as continuing to fight over this D file. Gensink bringing out his knight onto F6, attacking here. However, it is defended here. C3 with the knight. This is looking like a fine position here for both players. Knight coming out here, and we have a 3 knights game. And that's a little questionable. I see what he. I don't know. This is kind of. I mean, it's not a terrible move. It's not a terrible move by any means. Even if he does trade the knights off here, it's still about equal, and that bringing that bishop out is an equal position. This does open up Black's ability to castle. Now bringing the bishop out here to G5, putting pressure on the queen, pinning this knight to it, meaning that now this trade cannot happen, else white wins the queen. So Black can actually check here on B4. That would necessitate pushing it back. Knight here, probably just push the C pawn. Attack this knight. Where is this knight gonna go? Probably just back. It could come back over here, I guess. But this C move just pushes the knight back and wastes Black's move. White also should probably think about where he's going to castle. He does have most of his queenside pieces out. He could just decide to develop the queen here, and instead he plays A4, which, okay. And now C6, attacking this knight. Now what are you going to do with the knight? Probably trade here, screw up the pawn structure here on the queen side, and now basically the same thing here. I guess that's the plan. Take back here, or move. Probably take back. Either one of these is fine. The bishop is better so that you're not doubling your pawns here. But you want to make sure, A, that he doesn't just take here, and B, that he doesn't take here and then pressure your knight on top of it. Good move here from Gensink. He's got some decent control here. This is looking pretty darn good for Black. Queen probably should move out. Brings the knight out to attack this bishop, but it is protected here by the pawn. So just keep this in mind. This is an interesting move, putting pressure onto the rook, taking a free pawn potentially. Just if you do something like this, brings it out here, and then you can just move it right back, and it's just kind of okay. So he decides to push the bishop back and not question a trade. This is still a winning position for Black, although it's a little bit more questionable. Probably should have taken there. Queen is now attacking the bishop here, and Black now decides to protect the bishop with b6. This pawn protecting the bishop here. The queen cannot take back. I like this move potentially. He just takes the pawn with the knight. Black is winning here. H6 is probably your best move. Push this pawn back. You could castle, but I think at this point you're not really in any danger. You know, I think that just pushing this pawn, getting this bishop out of the way, and you know, trying to unpin this knight from the queen is really your best option. You could also start bringing this bishop out to b7. All right, so this puts pressure here onto the knight. So the knight should probably move, or it needs to have some sort of support, potentially queen c3. But honestly, bringing it out, that's a perfectly fine move here. Knight to f3. And here we do see this pawn push, putting pressure onto the bishop. Bishop should probably either move back. Actually, best move for the bishop would just be to trade off here. I think would be best for white. White instead moves back, and now you can just take this pawn. Yeah, this is winning a pawn straight up, because this is triply attacked by black. This is only doubly protected by white, and so you would be winning a pawn for free. Yeah, this is winning for black. Now the question is will Gensink see it? You know, this is kind of a puzzle. You need to be able to recognize that, hey, you have a lot of attackers onto this very, very scary e4 square. He instead opts to move his queen over, which removes that double attack onto that e4 square, in addition to excuse me, in addition to allowing white now to kind of make a decision as to what he's going to do. White now has kind of evened up the game. Castling here is probably his best option, or you could push e5. But instead he pushes a5. Bishop to b4 is check. And the king probably just has to move. You can defend here with the knight, I guess. But then, you know, you can take with the pawn here. Or you could just take with the bishop. It's probably also an interesting move. Try to bait the knight or the rook rather into taking that bishop and then taking back with the pawn. He just takes the pawn straight up, and now white is winning with e5. Now this is a tricky move to see, and he takes that pawn back on a5 with the rook. But idea here, if you take with the pawn here, he cannot take back with the queen because it's protected here, meaning that the queen has to retreat, meaning that you win the knight for free. So instead we get a5, and this is still on the table if black misses it. I would think about bringing the queen over here, or even better, getting the fork here on the rook and the king. So he should win. He should win the rook for free. Probably best move here is to actually better than that. This is the best move on the board right now, is moving this king over to d1, which is what he does, and he wins the rook. And black is now in great position. Gensink taking control of this game. Brings the queen over to attack this bishop. I like the idea of bringing the queen over here to attack this open c file. Also could bring the queen over here to b6, attacking this diagonal, attacking down this way, still protecting this bishop. Also queen to b4. You could just trade off the queens here. That's still a winning position for black. He decides to move the queen to c7 instead. Perfectly fine move, still protecting the bishop. and putting pressure on this c file. Gensink is looking really, really good right now. So hopefully for his sake he can keep it up. A win here for him would be huge. And for Drew it would basically depend on Gensink needing to win against Ironic Cannibal on Friday. Bringing the knight out here to d4. Not really doing a whole lot right now. Bishop to a6 is probably the best idea. Having these doubled bishops here, just a really interesting idea. He could also decide to castle now that the queen is starting to attack this diagonal with the king. Might be a good idea. But really, what he should do, he should either develop this this bishop onto this diagonal somewhere, or he should castle the king. Would be his ideal moves. Instead, bringing the knight down to g4. And now queen a3 makes this a little more iffy. Bringing some pressure onto here, preventing the king from castling, as a king cannot move through castle. Instead, pushes this pawn to put pressure onto the knight. This, however, is check. Putting pressure onto both the king and the bishop on f1, and that is what he sees. King is forced to move to e2. This is his only move, is king to e2. And that is what's played. Rook to b8. Bringing this rook over would have been best. However, taking the trade here, perfectly fine. I would have liked to have rather him c-take with the rook, because that would have opened his rook up on this file. And then eventually kind of get the idea of moving this king over here like this, to kind of protect himself behind the wall of pawns. Black does decide to castle in this position, but I don't like this from White's position. White is completely blocked off his last rook on the board, and from a positional standpoint, White is just White's straight up losing, both from a positional standpoint and from a point standpoint. Queen c1 check would win the rook if he sees it. King would be forced to move to either of these, to the second file somewhere, and then you win the rook for free here. Better to win the rook. You can give up the bishop here, perfectly fine. It's a matter of, is this the move you want to do? Oh, will he see it? Will he see it? He doesn't see it. Queen needs to move. Queen needs to move. Queen c7 is the best move here. Puts pressure onto the knight, protects this bishop here against the knight, which really doesn't need to, considering that the bishop would then have protection from both of the rooks. Also protects this here. Here it is again. Will White see it? Will Drew see it? He missed it once. He missed it. All right. Take it. Really, anything where you're moving the queen is winning for black. If you leave the queen there, it's bad. I mean, you could also push there. You could push there. Regardless, you need to get the queen out of the way of the bishop. He does move it. Okay. Black now solidly winning again. Bringing it down here to b2 next turn potentially for a check. Would either force it up to would force the king up to e3, or would force it back down, and then you're just getting another you're just getting a pin here, or a skewer rather, forcing the king back up. And then taking the rook for free. But yeah, even if you decided to do this, you could just go right back if you wanted to. There's There's options here for black. You could take this knight. I'm assuming that he's going to move the knight here. But, you know, who knows? It's really hard to say. He decides instead to take the pawn with the queen. And now, queen x b2. Queen takes b2. This is the move. Will he see it? You win the pawn. You put check on the king. The king has to move to e3. Or else you lose the rook. All right, let's see Gensink. He instead takes on e4. The pawn there. Sure. I mean, it's fine. As long, I mean, you know, this doesn't work as well anymore because now the king has extra escape squares. But queen d4 as well is also an option. Bringing this down here, kind of pinning the knight to the queen, limiting the options that the king has because now you have the queen on this diagonal. So either of these moves are perfectly fine here. It's just a matter of, will Gensink see them? He is down to 2.5 minutes on the clock. Oh, dude. Dude. He takes there. He takes here. You've just blundered your queen, and now white is winning. Now white is winning. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. This game can change in an instant. This game can change in an instant. You do not move your rook over to here. Do not move your rooks over. See the bishop. You made that mistake once with the queen. He made that mistake once with the queen. Will he see it again? He does. Best move is to do this. He could do this and be like, okay, you know, try to force a trade, I guess. Either way, white is cleanly winning now. I don't get it. I'm lost. You have to take here. You have to take here. Because if you take here, you just lose the bishop. You just lose the bishop. And black is in huge trouble. Down below 2 minutes on the clock as well. I mean, look at this material advantage. Black has 4 pawns. White has 5 pawns. Also has this passed pawn here on the d file. Also has the extra queen. I mean, all right, you gotta move. You gotta move the rook. You maybe here, just keep it out of the line of fire of the queen. This is where the queen can hit. You could move your king over too. A8, perfectly fine move. Now you have the idea of bringing this, starting to push this pawn forward. All right. Now white bringing his rook into play finally, after it's been freed off of the h file, and he now has time to get it out. Here we go. Moves the queen over. Now he's probably going to try to push this pawn down. He could actually need to be very careful. Be very careful here. I'd bring the rook over here to b8. I think would be fine. Putting pressure onto that pawn. F8 is also a great move. Because, and you can see here, this pawn here was doubly attacked. And now, I would push this pawn. I would push this pawn in this situation. If he takes the rook, fine. You know, that's perfectly fine. Because if you could take with the queen, yep. You know, this is basically keeping your game potentially alive here. If you can somehow get him to, if you can get this pawn to promote, this is something you have an option for. Now don't push it forward again. You know, I would say maybe push this forward. You could bring, you know, this over here. All right, he decides to push the H pawn as well. And now white has to make black lose. White needs to force this. I like this idea. Just get rid of this pawn. He brings the rook up instead. Putting pressure onto this rook. Now, rook to f5. Beautiful move. Beautiful move. Idea is here, putting the king in check, and then you can bring the queen over. I love the move here from white. Beautiful. It's f6. f6 is really your only option here. Black is really low on the clock. Black is below 20 seconds. Gensink needs to be very careful here. All right. This is mate in 4. If Gensink, you're down below 10 seconds. Watch your clock. All right, queen f6. Queen f6. Queen h6. You have options here. f6 is better. You can bring this idea here. Okay, decides to continue putting pressure onto this rook. Again, below 10 seconds. Gensink needs to make decisions. All right, looking to potentially trade this off. But white can just check here, and he does. And now the rook has to come back. Or you can push the king there. Queen to h8. Oh. Rook h6, trade off the rooks potentially. Black again, really low on the clock. 5.5 seconds on the clock. This might be a crazy ending if Gensink can keep time on the clock here. He's got to make a move. Got to make a move. Got to make a move. He does. All right. Back up to 5 seconds. Okay. He takes the queen. And now this is a lot more questionable. That was not a good move. Take the rook. Okay. Bring your king over. Bring your king over. Get ideas to bring your king down here. Try to get to this pawn. Try to get this pawn passed. Take the pawn here. He does. He'll take the pawn back most likely. He does. All right. King to g7 is probably the best move, or king to e6. All right. So now, white needs to push these pawns. Push these pawns in the middle of the board. Force him to make a decision. King there, that's fine. All right. Come down this way. Come down this way. Either way, you need to make a move. Okay. f7. White pushes the pawns. Bring your king over this way. You need to try to get this down. This is your only hope of winning. Be aware of that. And white wins by timeout. And that's it. DruPeirce wins the game, and he has secured himself a spot in the bracket round